Okay, I'm just gonna wait a minute before I start to give people the chance to enter the Zoom.
No problem. Well, one day I hope we can do this all in person again.
Really?
Yeah.
Jude, one thing I forgot to ask, should I also summarize Nadia's talk, use that summary, or just her bio? What would you say?
It's up to you, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, I'm gonna start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to note before anything that you have the option of tuning into the live Arabic translation through the globe button at the bottom of the Zoom. Today's event is taking place as part of Post-Colonial Ecologies, organized by Dar al-Funun, the Khaled Shoman Foundation. I'm going to give a brief intro about the project before moving on to Nadia and Karim, whom we are very pleased to have with us this evening. Thank you, Karim and Nadia, for being here. Unfolding through multiple exhibitions and online residency, public program, and summer academy, Post-Colonial Ecologies discusses and reflects on essential ecological questions, addressing how colonial practices and extractive economies have affected or contaminated the natural environments of indigenous peoples and native ecosystems. Departing from the epistemic violence enacted through dominant technologies of measurement and calculation that subdue life forms to market logic, the exhibition project unearths indigenous knowledge systems rooted in conceptions of nature and land as sources of life and subsistence. Thinking with Fanon, participants are invited to engage in critical readings of decolonization and to speculate on life futures that acknowledge land as the most essential value. Its humus, at once a carrier of collective memory, trauma, and a site of anti-colonial resurgence and regeneration. Against a modern grammar of predation and extraction, the multifaceted program invokes other worlds in the making, exploring radical forms of social organization that center mutual aid and more than human collaboration. Today's talk is part of the World Building in the Wake monthly series curated by Karim Stefan within the context of the Post-Colonial Ecologies exhibition project. Karim Stefan is a writer, editor, art critic, teacher, and PhD candidate in modern culture and media at Brown University, researching the poetics of witnessing and world building in Palestinian visual culture. Stefan is currently a fellow at Dar al-Funun. We can now move on to Karim, who will be telling us more about world building in the wake and introducing our guest Nadya Sbaiti before we start with the lecture. Thank you, and Karim, you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Jude. I'm really pleased to be hosting Nadya Sbaiti in the context of world building in the wake, and really pleased to have this monthly series in conjunction with the amazing Post-Colonial Ecologies exhibition project. So first, just a bit about the series. It takes as its premise that for those most vulnerable to the slow violence of extractive capitalism and settler colonialism, the end of the world is nothing new. To paraphrase the late scholar Patrick Wolfe, apocalypse is a structure, not an event. The catastrophe is ongoing. Or as June Tyson sings in Sun Ra's Space is the Place, it's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? The world building of Afrofuturism, Arab futurism, indigenous futurism, and other subaltern futurisms is animated by collective memories of the many worlds that did not survive the new world of colonial modernity. Futurisms divested from capitalist futurity, these speculative activities reorient the imagination to the poetics and politics of world building in the wake of catastrophe, so that visions of the yet to come are always also returns to the practices, epistemologies, and dreams of those whose worlds were expropriated or destroyed. They suggest an ecological consciousness that understands the present annihilation of biodiverse ecosystems as continuous with histories of colonization, enslavement, and genocide. Positioning the speculative practice of world building as a poetic act of repairing present and future ecologies in the wake of imperial violence, this series will feature artists, writers, and scholars who think beyond green futures to imagine a world transformed by decolonization and degrowth, a world that cultivates structures of care and kinship beyond the figure of the human. And so I'm very excited to have for the first talk of the series, Nadya Sbaiti. She'll be speaking about the profound imaginative, methodological, and existential possibilities that Arab science fiction offers people throughout the region as they navigate multiple crises, which I will not list because they are multiple. And it explores the genre's deep regional historical roots while also considering what the explosion in contemporary sci-fi output from the region indicates about current political needs and desires and the centrality of gender, race, and class dynamics to re-envisioning futurity. The talk will reference literature, film, and scholarship to inquire whether science fiction in its utopian and dystopian refractions can in fact open up spaces for hope and action. And it examines the parallel world-making possibilities of science fiction and revolution and the tools they offer us for reimagining the past and reframing the present. So to introduce Nadya Sbaiti, she is assistant professor at the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at the American University of Beirut. She's a co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliya as well. And at AUB, she taught an incredible class on Arab science fiction in a semester that would prove to be world-shaking for those in Beirut. So I'm very excited to welcome her to discuss some of the insights that came out of that experience. Welcome, Nadya.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Daratul Fanoon, to the organizers and the curators of the Post-Colonial Ecologies series, especially to Karim, who first extended the invitation, and to Jude, Reem, and Firas for making this possible. I'd also like to thank the interpreters, who I hope I don't make your job more challenging than it already is. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be speaking to this audience. And I look forward to having this time and space, and I use those words somewhat intentionally, to speak with you all about science fiction and what it can offer us imaginatively, politically, and existentially. And I also really look forward to learning more from the audience's own encounters with sci-fi and surreal in the discussion afterwards. So I come to the topic of science fiction, and specifically science fiction from the Arab world, from a two-pronged set of experiences that initially straddled and then fused the literary and the political. The first prong, or primarily literary, being my own longtime love of sci-fi, fantasy, and tales of the supernatural. I started reading them as a young girl, and the escapism, the imaginative opportunities to exist in different worlds simultaneously, the compassion and empathy that they evoked for creatures that looked and were formed differently from me, were all part of what kept me an avid reader of this genre. As I grew up, I graduated to some of the darker tales of dystopian worlds, everything from J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, to Philip Dick, to the race and gender conscious work of Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler, to name some of the more renowned authors. This literary living would fuse with the second prong of experiences in the fall of 2019 in Lebanon, when the Lebanese Thawra, as many of its participants would call it, erupted. I had taken up my position at AUB in 2015, the same year marked by the garbage protests. And just as a quick reference, the garbage protests erupted in August and September of that year, with the public demonstrated again against the breakdown of services, specifically garbage collection throughout Lebanon, as a symbol of a dysfunctional and corrupt system of cronyism. The ensuing 4 years, from 2015 to 2019, continued to be defined by a gradual but seismic deterioration in the quality of life for most residents in this country. Basic utilities lacked and lagged, environmental conditions worsened, the cost of living rose, and wage gaps and inequality widened. This period of political awareness converged with my growing interest in the genre of science fiction and fantasy writing in and from the region. I thus began to take seriously the pedagogical possibilities that this genre had afforded to me to make sense of the politics around us and what we were living. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East, and I'm also an educator for students here whose lives and futures have been and continue to be on the line. These are the evolutionary contours of my talk today, which are, of course, also influenced and affected by the emotions that living through a turbulent decade regionally and an incomparable 2020 in Lebanon specifically brought with it. So tonight, I want to share with you some reflections on Arabic science fiction, in particular through the lens of my experiences living, teaching, and being politically active in Lebanon, especially over the last 18 months. Lebanon's most recent popular uprising began by most accounts on the evening of October 17th, 2019. It was sparked by the government's plan to impose a tax on the popular application WhatsApp. But this came on the heels of unprecedented and uncontained wildfires that had blazed through the mountainous Shuf region for weeks prior to that. Lives, property, and the general biosphere were devastated as firefighting helicopters sat in idle disrepair due to government neglect. It was again symbolic of what had plagued decades of successive Lebanese governments: political polarization, mismanagement of public funds, and rampant corruption and waste. That same toxic mix would culminate again, hardly a year later, in disregard for residents' lives and well-being, with the Port of Beirut explosion on August 4th, 2020. But back in the fall of 2019, those days reflected the heady ways in which unbounded imagination structured protesters' demands for a better life in Lebanon, one that once and for all made political, economic, and moral sense. During those almost intoxicating weeks of protests, new possibilities were on display everywhere. Demonstrators and activists offered concrete plans to revise the constitution, overhaul the judiciary. They called for a public reclamation of privatized spaces and insisted on broad-based collective actions that would bring about an end to sectarianism, patriarchy, homophobia, and racism. But by the beginning of December, less than 2 months after the protests began, the popular mood had morphed from euphoric determination and utopian visions to despondency laced with desperation and an acute sense of loss. Faced with increasing violence from army, police, and militias, and compounded by a deepening economic crisis, organizing efforts felt stymied, if not downright crushed. The feeling was, in a word, brutal. The protests exposed the impoverishment of a certain epistemological hegemony that had, quote unquote, explained Lebanon as paradoxically exceptional in its purported westernized modernity, while also hopeless in its Oriental sectarianism. The inadequacy of these frameworks echoes those that had been applied to the region as a whole, ones that were quickly dispatched by the revolutionaries in the streets over the past decade around the region. Those mass movements that began in 2010 and 2011 and continued on were part of a century-long history of mass popular actions, whether as demonstrations or other acts of resistance, across the Middle East and North Africa. It was important to remember that protest and history did not start in 2011, although many people in the region, let alone around the world, needed to be reminded of that fact and of the legacy that they were part of. And yet still, when Lebanon was itself enveloped in revolution in 2019, the extended moment belied nearly all of the conceptual tools that I had taught and had amassed as an educator in and of the region. So it became clear to me that we needed new ways to capture and process what we were witnessing and living. What I was really looking for, in other words, was hope. Something to ground my desire for sustenance in some of the bleaker days. Methods that I could offer students at AUB for whom the stakes of the protests resonated so personally to help them imagine different possible futures and outcomes. As an avid reader of fantasy, science fiction, and speculative fiction, all I could think about were the ways in which these genres, these literary genres, were constituted by expansive imagination and world building through their play on time and space. Revolution, I thought, was not so different. It too is a world building exercise with the ability to mold time and space. And so in the spring semester of 2020, I offered a new course at AUB called Science Fiction in the Middle East. I designed the course as an interdisciplinary graduate seminar in which we engaged as both text and method a range of historical, legal, and cultural works of scholarship, film, and literature in translation and the original Arabic. There was a wealth of science fiction texts to emerge out of and about the Arab world for the previous 15 years, and I wanted to take advantage of it. I made it clear to my students at the outset that this course was an intellectual and pedagogical experiment. We were exploring the methodological possibilities that science fiction could offer everyone, scholars, activists, creative writers, in imagining alternative and even perhaps emancipatory futures in the region. But that goal, it turned out, would be almost immediately tested with the arrival of the coronavirus pandemic. Just 3 weeks into the semester, the first COVID-19 cases were reported in Lebanon. By mid-March, we were plunged into lockdown, what the Lebanese state authorities referred to as general mobilization, ta'bi'a 'amma. Weeks turned into months, each day seemingly ripped out of the pages of the most dystopic science fiction. The lethal and mutating virus, and which, as we know, is still mutating today, which also had no known cure, appeared at least briefly at the time to flatten people's experiences across the globe. Exponential rates of infection and death, shortages of food and supplies, social isolation, and the political leadership in nearly every country on the planet seemed inadequately prepared to meet any of these new challenges. In Lebanon, the pandemic and the general mobilization had also, of course, come on the heels of a popular mobilization. Demonstrations continued sporadically into 2020 and incidentally have begun again in 2021. People saw an end to a broken political system whose embedded corruption led to one of the world's most remarkable state-sponsored Ponzi schemes. As Lebanon's monetary house of cards came crashing down, so too did the national currency, which devalued by the week, sometimes by the hour. Today, it has lost close to 90% of its value, and the country is hobbling along on 3 different currency rates. Commercial banks, fearing a chaotic run on their brick and mortar branches, initially closed down, and when they reopened, allowed most customers only tiny cash withdrawals and prevented them from transferring funds abroad, even to pay for medical expenses or education tuition. And meanwhile, like their counterparts around the world, Lebanese politicians of various stripes did not let these nested crises go to waste. They cynically used the pandemic to roll back any ideological gains of the demonstrations and reinforce sectarian patronage systems, often by promising families and small business owners equipment and financial aid. Such inadequate assurances mostly went undelivered. Bankers instrumentalized the lockdown to justify locked bank doors and empty ATMs. Politicians turned a blind eye to inflation and massive economic suffering among more and more people. And while deaths mounted across the globe, Lebanon's dystopia grew. The lockdown continued to exacerbate the already precarious lives of large portions of the population. And the response of the political and economic elites exposed not just the rotten innards of the spaces we inhabited, but also the impoverishment of an elitist political imagination. We were settling in, not just for social distancing, but for something far more dystopic. And there I was in March 2020, so exactly 1 year ago, which is crazy for me to think, teaching a course on science fiction, now while living it, or at least living what felt like its most dystopian and sinister elements. During the initial fortnight of the lockdown, as I adjusted, we were all, I think, kind of just shell-shocked. So I was adjusting to the twinned shocks of national crises rather, and global infection and death, I wondered actually if this course still had any relevance. What was the point of reading dystopian science fiction when we were actually living something just as terrifying, and perhaps even more terrifying because we were living it and not simply reading about it or imagining it? The answer came in part by recognizing that the pedagogical power of science fiction sits in its simultaneous utopian and dystopian refractions. There is an imminent tension between inspirational possibilities and bleak futures that Lebanon seems to exemplify, though of course not only Lebanon, lodged in the cleft between a utopian revolution and its dystopian likeness. And I think these are echoed in the revolutionary trajectories of Egypt and Iraq, for example. I began to imagine the possibilities that this class in this place and at this time might help do to resolve some of this tension. And then a kind of incredible thing happened. Over the remaining 9 weeks of class, engaging with sci-fi's emancipatory aspects while simultaneously living its more menacing version, equipped my students and I with an unexpected sense of control. Whether we read Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad, Ibtisam Azim's The Book of Disappearance, or watched Larissa Sansour's Sci-Fi trilogy, the age of Corona, as many of us started calling it, no longer seemed like such an alien time. Our new and precarious world became more familiar than when any of us had first encountered it at the start of the semester a few weeks before. As COVID-19 metastasized, this class became our escape pod. In it, we could process the deep anxieties over what was happening all around us. Embedded in the comfort of our familiar dystopia was the sense that we might at least predict the next quote unquote real world plot twist. That feeling of control extended to harnessing the certainty of more unfamiliar otherworldly elements in the texts that we read so as to construct our own possible exits. In an important sense, the class revealed how sci-fi rests on conceptual and lived entanglements between familiarity, control, and escape. Perhaps more simply put, for a few sanity-saving hours every week, the class was therapy for both the students and for myself. And so what I want to do is take up a few of the strands that I feel are important in science fiction to think through how this might serve us imaginatively and methodologically as our realities continue to shape and shift under our feet. Part of the appeal of Arabic science fiction, and I think one of the most important aspects to think through, are its deep roots in the region. And I would say this is actually true for much sci-fi in the global south. The sharp uptick in science fiction and speculative fiction being published from the region over the last 15 years or so has led a number of people to argue that this has been an imported, read Western genre, and therefore has neither, quote unquote, authentic value, nor artistic, let alone political purpose. But nothing could be further from the truth. We live in a region that is steeped in science fiction and the fantastical. How many of us have grown up with stories about jinn or afrits, stories told to us in all solemn seriousness by aunts, uncles, or grandparents, let's say, over a game of cards? These jinn stories are not analogous to Halloween ghost stories, as some have dismissively claimed. As forces and figures with roots in Islamic history, the jinn are invoked for reasons that include explaining the unexplainable or as catalysts of events. They not only still occupy a key place in the cultural domain, and of course, one thinks of the recent Netflix show, for example, filmed in Jordan, but also in the religio-political domain. And here I'm thinking, for example, of the anthropological work of Ali Reza Dustar, who considers how jinn exorcisms in current-day Iran are implicated in the ways in which state authorities balance religion and politics. The point here is that themes of contemporary science fiction in the Arab world and the Middle East in general, what is now designated primarily as al-khayal al-ilmi, have drawn from deep literary and scientific heritage, as well as more nakedly political roots. Italian literary scholar Adina Barbaro considers works of older Arabic literature which may be regarded as antecedents of the genre. This ranges from the ajaib genre, the marvels, going back largely to the 12th century, with its sense of wonderment, to the utopias of Ibn Tufail's Hayy ibn Yaqzan from the early 12th century, where the author imagines a deserted island on which a child grows up alone, learning from nature and animals how to be a better human being. There is, of course, Al-Farabi's Al-Madina Al-Fadila, the virtuous city, around the 10th century, the scientific curiosities illustrated in Banu Musa's Kitab al-Hiyal, the Book of Ingenious Devices from the 9th century, and of course, the magical journeys of Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights, compiled in the 19th century, all foreshadow one or another aspect of science fiction and the fantastical in the long history of the Arab Islamic milieu. In all of these cases, themes revolved around technological marvels, the seeking out of a better or more utopian world in which man and nature are not only acknowledged one another, but often collaborated and communicated. Or in Alf Layla wa Layla, of magical beings who taught valuable lessons, or through some otherworldly deus ex machina that set a series of consequential events in motion. Many of them are framed as dreams, or use literary devices such as passing through magical doorways or mirrors. Still more were couched in religious or Islamic morals, but just as often sought to push back against superstition by thinking about the compatibility of rationality and religion. The early 20th century saw the reappearance of narratives of utopia inspired either by socialism, as with Farah Antoun's Ad-Din wal-Ilm wal-Mal al-Mudun al-Thalath, Religion, Science, and Wealth, the Three Cities, or religion, as with Muhammad al-Muwaqqit al-Marakshi's Al-Rihla al-Marakshiya, the Moroccan Journey. The first decades of the 20th century also saw a collection of writers publishing in journals and magazines in the Arab East. The novelist, journal, editor, and teacher, Jurji Zaidan, born in Beirut, died in Cairo, published in Al-Hilal in 1905, an article called Ba'd Mit Sana, after 100 years, where he lays out in detail what he imagines Egypt and what he calls the rest of the countries, Baqiyat al-Bilad, what they would be like. He details everything from the sandals that people wear to gardens of trees designed to bring healthful benefits, to a social life in which new languages, and then he says, like Esperanto, would enable better forms of communication, to technologies that enable people to send messages to each other via the phonograph or the gramophone. He envisions an air path, Khat Jawi, that would connect Egypt to China and Japan, but have stopovers in Jabal al-Sheikh in Lebanon and in Baghdad. His vision of a better society and future is based largely on technology. Also publishing in Al-Hilal a couple of decades later, Egyptian writer Hafiz Mahmoud published a number of pieces in the early 1930s, including In 10 Generations, Fi Ashrat Ajyal, The Prophet of Tomorrow, Nabil Mustaqbal, both published in 1930. And in 1932, Revolution in the year 2500, Thawra fi Sanat 2500. He envisions a more just society and a better justice system. In one, which is kind of remarkably prescient, and specifically for my talk today, Mahmoud imagines a time in which the Suez Canal becomes impassable and ultimately irrelevant as cargo is transported by spaceship. So publishers in Cairo and Beirut saw the potentialities of science fiction as a commercial project, and one with immense also entertainment value, right? It would basically sell issues of the journals and magazines. But it took a bit longer for science fiction to be taken seriously as kind of a stimulus for imagination and a way of conveying certain kinds of information, scientific information in particular. We have Tawfiq al-Hakim, who experimented in his works with science fiction elements in his 1950 publication, Fi Sanat Milyon, in his play Rihla ila al-Ghad of 1958, both inspired by Orwell's 1984. Algerian writer Mohammed Deeb, in his tale Who Remembers the Sea, published in 1962, uses fantastical imagery to convey the psychological terror of the Algerian War of Independence. Nihad al-Sharif, a prolific writer of Arabic science fiction, wrote his Qahir al-Zaman, or Victor Over Time, in 1972, in which the inventor works on a machine to freeze human bodies enabling their owners to hibernate and awaken later on. And of course, as one of the most widely read and translated writers, Emil Habibi's work, الوقائع الغريبة في اختفاء سعيد أبو النحس المتشائم, The Secret Life of Said the Pasoptimist in 1974, was for a long time one of the few works in this genre addressing or even foregrounding the Palestine question. Many of these writings grapple with the question of immortality, oftentimes a desire for it, sometimes a rejection of it. But in virtually each instance, each literary example, the yearning for a better world is front and center. Utopia is a main driver and a force unto itself. And I'll return to this framing later as we think about the political possibilities for which science fiction has been harnessed. Adina Barbara, who I previously mentioned, has argued that both the genre of Arabic science fiction and the critical tradition addressing it were stymied for a while in part by certain definitions of adab and tensions with Islamic beliefs in the mid-20th century. While the moon landing in 1969 reinvigorated interest in space travel, she notes, it would take another 2 decades until about 1990 before a real critical tradition in and of the genre would take flight. So many writers from the region began discussing critique as part of a growing genre of science fiction. The earliest is writer Yusuf Sharuni, who compiled and published a guide to authors and works in 1980. But then it wasn't until 1994 when you have Syrian writer Muhammad Azzam, who defined Arabic sci-fi in a way that centered mostly on technology, where writers predominantly described past and possible future discoveries and inventions. In 2001, Maha Masloum Khudr published a study specifically on modern Egyptian science fiction, where she emphasizes the role of colonization and cultural conflict in the formation of this literature, and argues that after Egyptian independence, sci-fi was used to imagine a new future for the country. And in 2007, the journal Al-Fusul put out an issue that centered science fiction and marked a key moment in its recognition as a genre. There's a linguistic cultural tension here that can't be ignored. We can think and we can see that Arabic science fiction as a genre is in part a result also of a symbiotic relationship with the genre's growth and production in the West in English. Many, of course, were influenced by authors like H.G. Wells, George Orwell, and of course, Mary Shelley, as we will see. Still, the regional roots of science fiction that I've insisted on outlining above shows that this is not an imported genre, which is the accusation leveled against this form of writing, particularly for the second half of the 20th century. It is far more organic to the region, and we must acknowledge that. Ignoring or arguing against this fact misses the depth of the roots of science fiction and fantasy in the Arab Islamic world, past and present, to say nothing of its future. Moreover, there has been a veritable explosion of sci-fi output in the region, novels, films, television, over the last 15 years, works which have been fundamental to building the genre into a force of literary, artistic, indeed political expression. These recent outputs are ultimately a reflection of the social, political, and cultural changes in the Arab world, and of the lived and imagined responses and critiques to these changes. And so for the remainder of this talk, I want to reflect on the context, the political backdrops against which some of the more recent Arabic science fiction has been produced. These works, put differently, have been written by authors who've lived and or are living events and moments that have demanded reconceptualizations or reconceptions rather of political possibilities, some of which may be on offer in or at least can be imagined through science fiction. Specifically, I want to dwell on how contemporary science fiction as political fantasy has delved into themes of time and space in its response to the rise of authoritarianism and tyrannical regimes, and its call for imaginative world building. As the title of my talk indicates, I insist here that we need to think about the Arab world as a center, not a peripheral afterthought of artistic production, ineffective technologies, or maimed bodies. Science fiction allows us to discuss the ways in which people in this center are continually engaged in world building. And as a center for this imaginative world building that we have witnessed in particular over the last decade, regardless of how we assess the success or failure of these uprisings, What has underwritten these world-building efforts was imagining a better future by harnessing and reimagining the past as well. Such considerations are what make this a genre of cultural and political productivity to watch out for, and dare I say, advocate for. So I want to focus here on what to me are the main themes that come up: temporality and the intersection of time and space, and the building and the dimension of futurity, and to interweave them with elements of the dystopian year that I have lived in Lebanon. Perhaps the most exhilaratingly joyful experience a reader of science fiction can have is as an escape from one's own life world. Our imagination can be fired up reading about extraordinary technological innovations, enhanced superpowers, and the malleability of natural laws of the universe. Sci-fi can offer a profound sense of play and a possibility. In so doing, it has to hit that sweet spot between painting a world unfamiliar and removed enough from the reader's daily life so as to render it an escape, while simultaneously making it familiar enough to be believable and thus emotive and thrilling. A sci-fi utopia is an unrealizable fantasy, but it must be believed as realizable. And it is between the familiar and unfamiliar, between the unrealizable and the realizable, that the power and effect of science fiction lies. In that vein, a central question animating my AUB course was, what role can science fiction play in parts of the world, like the Arab world, whose present can feel deeply dystopian, subject as it is to conditions of invasion and occupation and the relentlessness of privatization and militarization? In other words, to what degree did Arabic sci-fi feel familiar while maintaining enough unfamiliarity to be an escape? This question became particularly acute for those of us in Lebanon who have witnessed this devil's dance between economic implosion, political bankruptcy, and global pandemic. In the same vein, it's no accident that genres of science and speculative fiction have exploded in these parts of the world that have undergone the trauma of war, invasion, occupation, along with the concomitant metastasizing of neoliberal logics and practices. Sci-fi output has risen sharply in places out of Africa, South Asia, and South America. Similarly, in the MENA region, authors have used science fiction as a way to imagine other Egypts, Palestine's, Iraq's, or Algeria's, for example. Yet as we see, not all of those others are necessarily more utopian or even, frankly, just better. Several of the more recent sci-fi works are very much critical reflections of the last decade and a half of political and economic upheaval and the crushing weight of impossible and ungrievable life. In the novel At-Tabur, The Queue from 2013, Egyptian writer Basma Abdelaziz paints a surreal but familiar vision of an unnamed Arab city in which a centralized authority known as the Gate has risen to power in the aftermath of the disgraceful events, a failed popular uprising. Citizens are required to obtain permission from the Gate in order to take care of even the most basic daily affairs, yet the Gate never opens, and the queue in front of it grows longer. Abdelaziz's novel is a mirror on the sinister nature of authoritarianism and illuminates the way that absolute authority manipulates information, mobilizes others in service to it, and fails to uphold the rights of even those faithful to it. Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad takes place in the wake of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. We first meet Hadi, who collects body parts from the victims of car bombs, which he then stitches together to form a corpse who is then given life. At first, the body parts are of those killed, unrecognized, and unburied by the government. But when the corpse goes missing and a wave of murders sweeps across the city, Saadawi's book becomes a dark meditation on guilt and innocence and the way in which war, violence, and governing authorities survive by feeding off of the living. Imagining oneself or one's society out of colonialism and occupation, or no longer beholden to the structural inequalities of privatization, offers authors a profound way to critique the status quo while painting a deep yearning for change in the present. author Basma Ghalaini, who edited the book, the volume Palestine plus 100 years after the Nakba, points out that in the wider Arab context, science fiction has allowed for subversive acts of reframing the present, with leaders around the region regularly jailing writers and activists for their attempts to rethink the present and by extension, the future. Ghalaini says, quote, the option of recasting that present, reframing it through fantasy or science fiction is becoming more and more popular, unquote. And I would add, more urgent. This urgency has also translated into concern over the environment and climate change. Yemeni writer Abdel Nasser al-Majalli, in his recent Jughrafiyat al-Ma, the geography of water, creates a universe in which aliens siphon off Earth's water as revenge for the negative impact that the pollution produced by humans is having on the aliens' planet. Are the aliens justified savior or parasites? So what of the space-time nexus then? How does science fiction help us to think about time and temporality? And what in turn does that do to help us think through what we are all living in these days? I found it helpful to think with 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun. In his Muqaddimah, he invoked the human life cycle as a metaphor for his theory of historical time, in which a new civilization is born out of the conquest of the old one by nomadic invaders. It develops into maturity and then weakens and declines before meeting its inevitable demise in the form of a new nomadic invasion. And the birth, maturity, death cycle begins again. This notion of cyclical time was in part obviously dependent on nature's life cycles, the ebb and flow of tides and the flooding of rivers, the reaping of harvests, in addition to those nomadic invasions that he mentions. Contrast that with modern industrial and secular notions of what they call developmental or progressive time. In this notion, time is not dependent on climate or nature's rhythms or on nomadic invasions, which is of course a metaphor here for political and historical conditions, but rather was always and would forever be linear and teleological. If we use and extend Ibn Khaldun's human biological metaphor in the modern era, we see that modern developmental theory, modernization theory, for example, naturalizes developmental categories of childhood, adolescence, and sovereign adulthood. The idealized end is with the attainment of a healthy and sovereign adulthood, i.e. political maturity, now envisioned as a permanent state of developed statehood, sovereign statehood. So while Ibn Khaldun says the peak of civilization is simply part of a cycle and thus removes the pressures of violence or hierarchy, secular national time, secular nation state time, assume that sovereignty, i.e. adulthood, is the end of the road. It rejects the possibility of a continuous becoming, even as it is denied death, resulting in simply stasis. And as a brief side note, if we then think of the modern developmental life cycle as beginning with the creation of child or childhood, it makes you think about why so many protagonists in Western science fiction are children. Harry Potter, for example, the characters of N.K. Jemison's trilogies, Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, right? They all use childhood protagonists. What does this symbolize in terms of recentering the need to a constant becoming, the centrality of time and temporality to that very process, and the implication that come adulthood, we can no longer imagine anything else, anything better, any future. Many Arab sociologists and political philosophers of the mid-20th century engaged with Ibn Khaldun's narrative of historical time. They saw much of Islamic history in general, and modern Arab national histories in particular, as a cyclical struggle between, quote, people of the state, quote, and, quote, people of the revolution. Constant resisting of the modern state via revolution prevents the state from becoming and remaining unjust. Engaging with the Khaldunian conception of cyclical time, as well as with earlier Islamic concepts of moral decline and revival, allowed many of these thinkers and writers to bypass the kind of foreclosed inevitability that came with what Jacques Derrida has called the tiresome trajectory of every 20th century secular political ideology. Thinking about it another way, the Arabic term for state, dawla, carries with it the root word meaning change, rotation, flux, dal, waw, lam. The English word state doesn't allow for that. Instead, in its definite endpoint of developed, it implies a condition of stasis, an arrival to the end of history, as it were. As such, modern linear national time is not revolutionary time. Ibn Khaldun's conception of historical time introduced a social analysis and a linearity into existing cyclical conceptions of civilizational rise and fall. His philosophy of history is a linear narrative of cyclical time. Throughout that, though, Ibn Khaldun maintained the dynamic cyclicality implicit within the word dawla, and which contrasts with the fixity of the modern state. As Frederick Jameson has shown, in the modern state era, teleological notions of progress and time create a situation in which it is that fixity, the belief in the permanence of a hegemonic system, whether political or economic, that matters most for whether people will see it as a utopia or not, and whether there will be a revolution or not. It is those conditions of stateness in the name of the arrival of sovereignty, sovereign adulthood, in other words, or of fixity, of the unchanging conditions of insecurity, inequality, injustice, and resource erosion that have been maintained over decades. It is those conditions that move people over the last decade around the region, including in Lebanon, to reject the idea of the impossibility of change and to push hard for making their own and to set the clock of life to their own schedule, what we can call revolutionary time. For Lebanon, this came about in a few ways and drove home how discussions of time are also inextricable from discussions of space and spatiality. Over the last year, time has continued to feel nonlinear. Unlike revolutionary time, Corona time has made every day seem both fleeting and interminable, beset by the same routine and occurring between the same walls, floors, and ceilings. Space-time compression is made real with Zoom. We have all contracted to tiny boxes on a screen. We're all talking heads. And whether we have spent months away from our loved ones or intensified contact with them or spent the lockdown alone, we've all been forced to reckon with our emotional selves. And so with its vast universes and its myriad realms, characters, and outcomes, science fiction can remind us that we can, in fact, exist in dimensions more expansive than our physically and temporally circumscribed present suggests. It does so by re-expanding our dramatically shrunken world. COVID-related lockdown has confined us at home for so long that venturing 6 blocks feels like interplanetary travel. And as our bodies stretch across our couches, our sofas, and not countries, those of us with suddenly useless passports are now experiencing 1 iota of the ways in which others who are incarcerated or undocumented move through space, or don't. And it no longer feels, in the words of Star Trek, right, that space is the final frontier. Instead, we are. The August 4th, 2020 explosion at Beirut's port added an extra dimension to our sense of time-space. The blast, considered the 3rd largest in modern history, leveled the port area, destroyed surrounding neighborhoods, and was felt as far away as Cyprus. The Lebanese government continued its role as negligent bystander, as thousands of mostly young people from around the country poured into Beirut to provide some much needed help. These volunteers undertook the arduous, heartbreaking, and soul-sustaining process of sweeping up debris. Even now, 8 months later, there has been no accountability, and residents are still assessing how long it will take to restore the lives, homes, and hopes of what remains of futures in this country. Lebanon's residents are still living dystopic science fiction between the familiar and the unfamiliar, For certain generations like mine who lived through the Civil War, explosions are familiar. The port explosion, the port devastation, however, was utterly unfamiliar in its incomprehensible and apocalyptic scale, scope, and momentary impact. And in a perfect encapsulation of science fiction as suspended between utopia and dystopia, COVID-19 actually saved lives. In healthier times at 6:08 p.m. on an August evening, the shops, bars, restaurants, streets of the neighborhoods around the port would have been infinitely more crowded. The port itself bustling with far more employees. So to think about a global pandemic as a lifesaver from thousands of tons of explosive ammonium nitrate, what worlds are we living in? In her very widely regarded article published in April of 2020, writer Arundhati Roy argued for thinking about the coronavirus pandemic as a one-way portal, an opportunity to allow us to, as she said, break with the past and imagine the world anew, unquote. In Lebanon, however, the pandemic is not a one-way portal. Both it and the port explosion confirmed continuity through contrasts, past, present, and future. In Lebanon, we are still simultaneously living in three temporal frameworks that are also inherently spatial: revolution, corona, and explosion. During revolutionary time, bodies tightly packed into squares and streets signified a demand for life. We wore masks to protect us against tear gas while shielding our popular movement. During corona time, bodies tightly packed into any space are a harbinger of conceivable and now likely death. We wear masks to protect us from one another. And during explosion time, we wear masks to protect us from the toxic fumes of destruction and decay, a sign of shared vulnerability to a political class and system that serves only itself. These times coalesce and pull at each other. And what of time lost? The destruction has already altered the spatial logics of the city and generated a temporality of its own. The question of just how irrevocably that is remains to be seen. And it's not just in Lebanon, right? Science fiction captures this question of temporality elsewhere too. In Saadawi's novel, for example, in the case of Iraq, the stitching together of body parts and the need to replace them over time is also a meditation on the expandability and malleability of bodies over time. So we can talk about this more. So the question is, what tools does science fiction offer us to think about revolution as world building? Sci-fi has its own utopian and dystopian plot lines and themes. It can valorize the most dystopian context possible, where technologies, racial and gender hierarchies, and an idealized future are written. For example, science fiction's emphasis on technology has often seemed to privilege a prosthetically enhanced future world, or alternative world at least. But disability activists and sci-fi writers have shed light on sci-fi's more ableist tendencies and are contributing science fiction works that begin to upend those biases. So in that sense, science fiction can also do important anti-colonial, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-normative work. Our normal world, quote unquote, the one that so many have yearned for a return to over this past year, was always someone else's dystopia. Sci-fi's multiverse disrupts both existential and epistemological claims to a so-called universal human experience that has oftentimes presented like the most dystopian realm to many raced, classed, and gendered people. Science fiction literary and artistic output increasingly serves as a witness for the lives of those who have long existed on the political and social margins and who have been the targets of technological, colonial, medical, social, and political experiments. Accessing science fiction can thus feel like the rewriting, right? The sort of correction, the rewriting of a world that has hitherto constantly felt upside down. Meanwhile, rewriting in the process of writing, rewriting oneself or one's communities out of colonialism and occupation, or out of a world in which everyone always has natural limbs, or as no longer hostage to structural inequalities, can empower the critique of status quos and the struggle for more promising futures. It allows us to refuse the not yet, to finally exit what Dipesh Chakrabarti has called the waiting room of history, wherein the global north keeps the rest in permanent suspense of deferral, of waiting for justice, for sovereignty, for statehood, for visas, to recognition. To borrow from Basma Abdul Aziz, to step out of the tabur, step out of the queue, where people are being written out of history by being written out of the future. And thus, writing science fiction is a spatial, temporal, and existential center, a way of claiming that future, regardless of whether the future is bleak or not, because it is finally owned by you. Within the domain of academic knowledge production, science fiction offers methodological tools that anthropologists and political scientists primarily have begun to use in order to theorize from the region and away from the discipline's totalizing claims to universality. In anthropology, science fiction's social purchase is increasingly as a political and moral compass to navigate our current day predicaments like climate change, capitalism, and racism. For political science and international relations, texts like Hassan Balasim's The Corpse Exhibition is one of several works of Arabic science fiction and horror whose creative research potential is being taken seriously in order to rethink the implications of so-called security studies on the populations of the global South. Over the past year, I, like many others, observed the collapse of some academic and media pundits' explanations, quote unquote, of the uprisings in Lebanon and Iraq in particular. This moment that we've been living in of futures unknown and futures conceived can be fruitful for grounding new theories of and for these places, instead of trying to make them fit into prepackaged, largely Western-driven models. Disrupting academia's disciplinary hegemonies could, in this moment of entangled and layered disasters, help us theorize out of the region and into broader solid action. As we think about the various popular mobilizations around the region, from Tunisia to Iraq, I have found it helpful to think about revolutions as a form of science fiction, not because they are fiction and therefore impossible to realize, but because they are centers of world building and of imagination. This is not about assessing or evaluating some idea of success or failure of any of the uprisings that have taken place over the last decade, but rather to know that these were spaces where imagination was and is rife and solid. In a world that is increasingly hostile to imagination and its political effects, science fiction, its possibility for writing the world, and with its play on time and space, will have an increasingly important role in the years to come, as modernity and progress have tried to predict and control the future, to prevent it from being a source of disruption, to colonize the unknown, as Frederick Jameson has said. Revolution has in fact disrupted that attempt at future certitude, rewired the temporality, the terminology, and turned the unknown into a horizon of what's possible. As geographer Hiba Abu Akar has said, a post-colonial approach to hope would recognize that the horizon for hope, its temporalities and its scale of possibilities, is a political question. What bears remembering is how different and non-linear each of the different uprisings have been. And therefore, it is good to remember how wrong we would have been to anticipate disappointment. It's hard to think about this and to stay hopeful sometimes when we are all in the midst of a collective sort of grief, many of us for years now. As a close friend recently reminded me, this collective grief needs to be named and acknowledged between and amongst ourselves. How do we locate hope in such dark moments and dark spaces? As a colleague who's been living in Egypt for the last 20 years has said to me, the heroism required for dealing with the current despair should be documented. I'm hoping that science fiction can help us do that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nadya. That was a beautiful and very rich talk. And I'm sure that people have a lot of questions for you. And we have about half an hour, a little under half an hour for that. So I just want to say to all those in attendance, you can drop any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up shortly. But I'll begin by asking a question or making something of a comment. I think you spoke beautifully about the different temporalities that are captured by science fiction, but also by revolution itself, which reworks, in your words, molds time and space. One of the things that struck me as you spoke about what is distinct about, for example, the movement towards a state and movement within a state in the Arabic and in the English, with dawla, referring in some way to change that is not present for the static of the Western state. I was thinking about, one of the theses of an author that you mentioned frequently, Frederick Jameson, who, for Jameson, who, is famous for saying it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. He says about science fiction that maybe what it does most is dramatize our inability to imagine the future, right? He emphasizes that even when science fiction is envisioning the future, it is precisely where it fails to do so that it's most instructive. And maybe similarly, the Black queer science fiction writer Samuel Delany has said that science fiction is not about the future. It is a significant distortion of the present, in his words. So I wonder, first, if you're seeing if you see a difference in Western approaches to time within science fiction, or the imagination of time there, or if this is also about the experience of revolution over the last 10 years, since you're speaking, of a recent explosion. You mentioned many works that are imagining the future. Are they imagining the future, I guess, is the question. Or are they reworking the present in ways that, bring different pasts and futures in? How would you approach that question?
Thanks so much for this excellent question, Karim. This is why sort of early on, and it might have, borne repeating. I'm saying that, first of all, I think that absolutely drawing on sort of Jameson and Delany to think through kind of the way that science fiction is even in its kind of thinking about the future is actually sort of, recalibrating or reformulating the present, and therefore is indicative that there is no future. I think this has some resonance in a lot of the works, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. I think there's far more of that in the preceding decades, sort of that first half of the 20th century, some of those texts that I was looking at, where there is clearly an imagining and a desire for thinking about what are the possibilities, whether technological, political, social, right, that exist. So I think we have to break up thinking about Arabic science fiction perhaps into some sort of periodization in order to answer this question. I definitely think that over the last, say, 15 years, so in light of, the basically 21st century, let's say, Arabic science fiction, which has happened in the wake of 9/11, of the invasion of Iraq, of sharpening and hardening authoritarianism, of the increased jailing of any kind of dissent, around the, even before the revolutions, but definitely in the wake of them. I think there are ways that we can definitely relate those to the Jameson and Delany sort of references that you bring up. But this is also why, going back to something I was saying earlier, I think they are still thinking about a future. It's just a future that may not be better, right? It's a future that is actually allowing them to process what's happening now, and perhaps is trying to be used as some sort of abra, of a lesson of, what do we need to know about our present in order for us to then imagine our way out of it, right? And perhaps there's this impossibility. We can't imagine a future that looks different than rehashing the present until we've rehashed the present. So perhaps we're kind of stuck, in this kind of, literary, theoretical, existential cycle for the moment. Particularly as so many of these have been written in the wake of the invasions and the wake of revolutions that, in the words of Basma Abdelaziz, right, the sort of disgraceful events, which tells you a lot about, where they see, where they see the present going. But I think thinking about science fiction alongside revolution and thinking about the imaginative qualities of both of them in parallel is actually what helps us to perhaps widen the context in which we read some of the science fiction, and also simultaneously help widen the way in which we can assess perhaps or evaluate this last decade of uprisings, protests, revolution across the region. And thinking about, to again go back to something I said at the end, that there's a way in which we to have anticipated any kind of failure, of disappointment, right, I think would have been a foreclosure at a time when those foreclosures were not possible. And so perhaps it's less about saying definitively, are these texts, or is this sci-fi production actually envisioning a future, and more about the methodological possibilities that science fiction offers us for what it means to be able to envision a future. And I think there's a distinction and a nuance there that's worth keeping in mind, and why the revolution and science fiction as two world building entities and the interplay between them can be really generative. Or maybe Absolutely. I'm just in a good mood today. So, but I think I think there are distinct ways in which thinking about science fiction as methodology is different than thinking about the science fiction, texts in terms of their plots and outcomes. And the distinction is there. Yeah.
I think, in terms of the ways of thinking that science fiction enables. And also, you made an important distinction between, the kind of familiar and potentially uncanny, and the entirely unfamiliar, which in a way we wouldn't relate to, we wouldn't want to read. So that speaks also to the aspects of the present and the horizons of the present, right, that are there even in future imaginations. Mm-hmm. We have some questions coming in from the audience, so mm-hmm. I want to get to those. First of all, there are 2 requests already for reading lists. So
yes, happy to provide.
We can talk about how we provide that if you're open to that, to those who have attended. But so a question from Aman: how do you see post-capitalist global utopias such as Another Now and the one imagined by Yanis Varoufakis fitting into the world of utopian science fiction in the Arab world? Do they in fact fit in view of the relationship between the global North and the global South? Can and should bridges be built between these 2 story worlds?
So I'm sorry, you cut out right at the beginning. Can I ask you to just repeat that question again? Sorry.
Sure. So how do you see post-capitalist global utopias such as Another Now? I don't know if this is a project that Yanis Varoufakis is working on, or if this is 2 distinct things, Another Now and Varoufakis's DM25, for example, fitting into the world of utopian science fiction in the Arab world. Do they in fact fit in? And in view of the relationship between the global North and the global South, can and should bridges be built between these 2 story worlds?
This is why I love doing the talk like this, because I have not looked at Varoufakis's projects or the if not now. So this is also like, I'll give you guys a reading list. You give me a reading list. This is a great reciprocal relationship that we've got there. So thank you for the question. I think that there are ways in which, thinking about utopia in both of these contexts is important, right? The whole idea of utopia as being to go back to something Jameson said, being an unrealizable fantasy yet one which just has enough to make one think that it's realizable. And so it's at the fundamental core of that is this idea of hope, right? That you've got to have at least some kind of core, some grain of hope and hopefulness, some idea of the possible in order to push forward a particular, utopic vision. And the whole point of utopia is that, of course, there's no such thing as utopia. For everyone, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, right? So even this is why the refraction, thinking about science fiction as sitting in this cleft between, a utopian, let's say, revolution, or a utopian, new world, and its dystopian refractions, it's always going to be that way. And so again, I come back to the sort of methodological possibilities that thinking about something that is, more quote unquote real world, let's say, as that Varoufakis's plan is. I would just encourage us to bear in mind kind of, how do we think, what are the political possibilities of hope in being just enough to push us forward to continuously reach for a better society and a better future, whether in the global north or the global south, but also bearing in mind that that is only a utopia for a certain, portion of the population, or a certain, percentage of the world, or, whatever it is. And so just being kind of, it's asking us to sit in this kind of impossible place, which is to be just realistic enough to know that this utopia has its dystopian refractions, but yet optimistic enough to want to constantly push forward for a better kind of society and future. So
right.
That may or may not answer the question, but yeah.
Reading lists, that's a great idea. So a question from Ben Ashraf, also speaking from Jordan, of Al-Arabi Al-Jadid. I treasure science fiction's role in providing a foundational ethics of unbelief, whilst at the same time, as you have beautifully articulated, positing ways in which we can pursue experimental productions of collective bodies. I often find, from a personal background in exploring sonic fictions like jazz, there's no difference between a universe, a religion, and a hoax. This is wonderfully emancipatory if we are to engineer practical fictions. In the Arab context, the collective consciousness of 2011 and onwards has provided a stimulus for doing so. How important do you or did you see the events of 2011 within this context? And from a Lebanese perspective specifically, what do you think will be the driving means in which we can continue to see such a flourishing in alternative ways of imagination?
I feel like I'm being asked to resolve all the regional issues.
Yeah. I don't know if, I'll add another question because it kind of relates and I think is maybe equally difficult to answer.
Bring it on.
Another asks, do you think revolutions in their conventional sense are the best way to bring about the needed change, or are there better ways to change the obsolete status quo?
I mean, I'm hoping that what I'm about to say in part answers your question, Karim, and also your question, Ben. Thank you so much for asking that. And also it's a beautifully worded question. And yes, God bless jazz. I think what science fiction, in my experience, and this maybe relates more specifically to Ben's question when you're asking about from the Lebanese perspective, I think what science fiction as literature and as world building literature and the imaginative sort of dimensions of it has allowed me to do, and this was something that we explored in my course and that I've just kind of been living as, after that over this past year, is it's allowed me at least to broaden my idea of how to define revolution. If we think about the ways, the pillars that buttress revolution, the way that it alters our idea of time and temporality, of the past, of the sort of uses to which the past is put, reshaped, reformulated, thinking about the directions that we can go in. The fact that, like I think I started my talk thinking about, for so long, not knowing what a future holds has oftentimes been something that's scary. One of the things I think these revolutions, especially in their beginnings, did was create this notion of an unknown future as actually something yet to be written, right? A time yet to be filled, to be owned, by you, as opposed to kind of foreclosed by the lack of job opportunities or the guaranteed immigration process, for example, right, that so many have faced. So I think that one of the things that science fiction has afforded me imaginatively and also just practically is just to help broaden this notion of what constitutes revolution. That it's not necessarily always in kind of the mass outpouring, for example, of people on the street, but of small, efforts on the part of collectives, of organizers, of students, of artists, to try to really rethink and think more clearly about kind of what is possible, what isn't possible. What is the role that art can play? What is the role that film can play? That music can play. I think one of the things that you're asking, Ben, that made me think of the songs and the chants and the poetry that emerged on the streets of almost every one of these spaces, right? In so many of these places. And I think that there's the oral, right? The audio version, the whether it's music or poetry, or even the ways in which church bells and calls to prayer became incorporated in many of these moments. I think there's a way in which if we think about incorporating the different sensory, like expanding the sensorium of the sequence of events that has happened over the last 10 years, there are ways in which we can think beyond simply whether people moved out into the street, whether they, what happened to them, whether they, have had to, proceed through lockdown. I mean, the fact that there are still waves of protesters coming out in the streets in Iraq, in Lebanon, even in Egypt, up to a point, I think testifies to the fact that even a pandemic lockdown, right, has not actually suppressed so much of this energy. And so I think that the driving, I think we just need to hold on to the possibilities that maintaining imagination offers us. Because the authorities, whether institutional or governmental, are doing their best to clamp down on that for reasons that we are seeing, precisely because, even in the rehashing of a bleak present, right, in some of this stuff, we're still rehashing it. There's a lack of acceptance. And I think that is central to all of this.
And this is a question coming in from Southampton, Britain. If science fictions are so revealing about the presence in which they have been written, is there any value in reading and studying science fiction from the past beyond the historical insights they offer?
Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so if sci-fi is so revealing about the present in which it has been, or the multiple presents in which science fictions have been written, is there any value in reading and studying sci-fi from the past beyond the historical insights they offer?
I mean, absolutely. Beyond I think the historical insights are, central to so many. I mean, you're also talking to a historian, so I may be slightly biased, but I think the historical insights, they are central to understanding the present, the future, and also the past. I mean, as we, I think one of the things, particularly those of us who are educators, that we're finding is that increasingly, there is diminishing knowledge, let's say, of particular kinds of histories, of pasts. I think about this particularly in the case of Iraq. In the wake of the 2003 invasion, with the shifting and with the burning of archives, with the moving of archives out of Iraq into different places in the United States, the Pentagon and the Hoover Institute at Stanford. The question remains, so how does one write then a post-invasion history of Iraq, right? If you're not already in the US, for example, if you don't already have certain kinds of privileges. In other words, can an Iraqi historian write a post-2003? And so one of the things that's emerged is the way in which fiction and literature have become stand-ins for history writing in Iraq, precisely because of the different ways in which they can play, right, with the present, with notions of what possible futures there are, because they are also able to bring in and rethink and frame particular ideas of an Iraqi past in ways that are critical, right, and are central, but appear to be fictitious, right, because they're in literature. So I think there are ways in which we shouldn't necessarily underestimate the role that harnessing and shaping and sort of channeling the past has in this particular kind of output, whether it's film, literature, television, etc.
And so this is a question from Iyad in Berlin. Could you comment on the history of teaching science fiction in Lebanon or elsewhere in neighboring countries? I'll just add to that. I remember that when you said you were going to be teaching this course on Facebook, there was just a flood of comments, people so excited about the course, talking about their favorite texts and so on. So, I mean, that might speak to the sense that it felt novel or particularly timely, but is there a history of teaching sci-fi either in Lebanon or elsewhere that you're aware of and can comment on?
Thanks for this question. I don't know of any I know of courses that since then have taught, and I don't necessarily take too much credit for having inspired these courses. I just know that there have been a couple of courses at AUB in different departments like fine arts, and I think architecture, maybe a couple of them sort of were bringing in different elements of science fiction, but not necessarily a course on science fiction, and certainly not one that solely focused on the Arab world or the Middle East. To my knowledge, and I would love to be corrected on this, there are no similar courses that have focused on science fiction in and of and from the Middle East in the way that I have done. And I was very explicit about wanting to actually root it. So I got a lot of inquiries from students, saying, "Are you going to talk about Dune?" And I was like, "No, I'm not going to talk about Dune." It's we're moving beyond Dune. So if you know of anyone who has taught this course elsewhere or who is teaching it, I would really love to know about it. And yes, I crowdsourced many of the readings on Facebook, as Karim was saying, and so much of what I learned so much from this. And I think, again, this just says that learning is a collaborative enterprise. Learning and writing and teaching, it's a collaborative enterprise. So this is, to me, this talk and this conversation that we're having today is just another part of it. So thank you.
And this is a question from Philip in South Carolina. What thoughts do you have, if any, on the concept of allegory for reading and interpreting science fiction from the Middle East? I missed the first part of the talk, he says, so sorry if I missed that, but I don't think you addressed allegory specifically.
I thank you for that question. I'm going to give you a very unsatisfying answer, which is I haven't talked about it. I have not actually given much thought to it, to be perfectly honest. I haven't come across, and again, I would love to hear from folks out there who may have had different experiences. I haven't come across texts, at least not in the last, not in this kind of surge that I think has happened over the last 15 years or so, where allegory has been a central kind of, mechanism or literary tool. But certainly for some of the earlier science fiction, from obviously Alf Layla O Layla is full of allegory, right? And even some of the texts from the early 20th century, I imagine that there's definitely parts there. But I think, to me, allegory is part of sort of that earlier period of the sort of fantastical, supernatural science kind of genre of science fiction, early science fiction material that then became included in science fiction, right? There's a whole way in which the emergence of the genre as kind of a genre is something that's also, right, which I mentioned, is also something that is kind of relatively new. And the way in which it's starting to become, you know, the subject of critique and, you know, somewhat institutionalized, right? So, which is interesting, which gives me which I think goes back to answer the earlier question, right? Ayad's question, which is, you know, at some point, I think this will be a frequent course. And I would love to know, perhaps, I know, Jude, you were saying earlier that this is, you know, that you're part of a different kind of reading group. And so perhaps there are also circuits of knowledge production that universities, you know, are part of, but are also excluded from. So I would love to know if there are people teaching at, you know, I mean, I'm at the American University of Beirut. I would love to know if there are people teaching at Arabic language universities who are interested in courses like this.
All right. Thank you so much, Nadya, for a very beautiful and thought-provoking talk. And thank you, Karim, for the great effort that has been put into organizing this. I was gonna just come in with maybe one last question before Karim concludes. So I wanted to invite you to engage with this quote, not necessarily because I agree with it, but because I think it's timely insofar as it allows us to further reflect upon the relationship between science fiction and decolonization and technology and decolonization. So it's a quote from the Canadian science fiction writer Nalo Hopkinson, who wrote, "To be a person of color writing science fiction is to be under suspicion of having internalized one's colonization." So I was wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Could you repeat the quote, Jude? Sorry.
Yeah. To be a person of color writing science fiction is to be under suspicion of having internalized one's colonization.
Do you know when that quote was said?
I'm not sure about the year, but do you, Karim?
Yeah, I mean, it was in the early 2000s, right? It's her intro to So Long Been Dreaming, and she's speaking about basically meeting a Black radical scholar who is suspicious of why she's writing science fiction because of its colonial roots in many ways.
Right. I mean, yeah, thank you so much, Jude. This is fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. I think that up until, I mean, this is why it's interesting to think about the sort of, you know, kind of surge of science fiction coming out of, you know, MENA region, certainly, but also, you know, South Asia, places in Africa, in multiple languages, obviously, within the last like 15 to 20 years, because I also think this has happened in, you know, consonant with, and at the same time as a rise in science fiction produced by written by authors of color in parts of the United States and perhaps parts of Western Europe, maybe the Anglo-American kind of context, perhaps. And so much of it is, I think, happening in parallel. There is an acknowledgement, right? And I think this is happening a little bit more in the context of the North American place that you're talking about, the Canadian context, right? That there's a recognition that science fiction has colonial roots, certainly, white supremacist roots, certainly, right? Which is part and parcel of that. But also a way in which I think authors of color, inspired in part, I think, by Afrofuturism, have recognized, again, the imaginative, potentially liberatory possibilities of writing oneself, right, to paraphrase Octavia Butler, out of a particular context of white supremacy and colonialism, and writing yourself into a world and a narrative of your own choosing, right? So being able to choose what your past looks like and not what it's imposed on you or you're told that it is by colonial pasts, enslavement, right? And also picking what your present looks like, and obviously what world you want to be part of. So I think there's a reason that there's been this concomitant upswing in science fiction by authors of color and in science fiction by authors over the last 15 years in parts of the world, that we talk about generally as the global South. Because there is because of the last sort of 20, 30 years of like rising neoliberal logics and practices, of reoccupation in many cases, neo-colonialism in many cases, the brutal impact of privatization across the world and militarization. I think there is a reaching. I don't think I'm alone in the fall of 2019 deciding I need hope, right? And finding it in science fiction. I think this is absolutely, there's a taking back, if you want, of science fiction in the context of the quote that you were telling me about. That is very similar to, I think, what authors here have looked at. And the difference is that, people here have also, in the region, have also, understood, no, this is, okay, we can be influenced, Ahmed Saadawi's case, we can be influenced by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But we also have this long history of it, right? So it's also part of who we are, right? This is not necessarily about, and I think here is the difference, is that in this region, there's a way in which there's a recognition, like I'm harnessing my heritage when I write something like this. Whereas in the North American context, right, there's a way in which there's a reclaiming, a taking back of a particular kind of literary method or tool in ways that are they're about rejecting a particular kind of heritage that's been imposed and making one up for yourself, right, as you go along. So this is, off the top of my head, how I would engage with it. But thank you. This is incredible prompt.
Thank you so much, Nadya.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful to have you. I think, many people really are commenting how moving the talk was, and yeah, really rich to have at this moment. And speaking of this moment and uncanny time, Nadya Sbaiti is under curfew, like all of the residents of Lebanon. So we should wrap up here.
You can't make this up. I mean, it's like the perfect context in which to hold this talk.
So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to Jude, Reem, Firas for hosting, to Darat Al-Funun and the interpreter for doing what must be extremely challenging live interpretation in Arabic. And I hope to see you all at future Darat Al-Funun events and at other world building in the wake talks. The next one will be coming up on April 20 with art historian TJ Demos.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who attended and for your fabulous questions and engagement. I'm really touched. I loved it. Thank you. Reciprocal reading lists. I haven't forgotten. Thank you all.
We'll figure out how to make those accessible to the attendees. Yeah. Absolutely.
Let me know. Absolutely. Thank you all, and stay safe and healthy, everyone. Stay imaginative.